Good afternoon, everyone. As we begin today, I'd like to share that eQuo is founded on core principles of unity and diversity, equality, inclusion, and mutual respect, which we believe are important cultural values toward establishing an equal spirit of community. So with this in mind, I'd like to thank Rye Barberstock, an advisor for eQuo and also a member of Wolf Clan, member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, for being my guide in the following land acknowledgement. We believe that understanding comes from sharing knowledge, and Rye taught us that a land acknowledgement is an opportunity to express our gratitude, but it's also an acknowledgement of our positionality and identity, as well as our treaty obligations to honor, respect, and care for the land, water, natural resources, peoples, and the ecosystem which sustains us all. So eQuo recognizes that our work and the work of its community partners is conducted on the inherent and treaty lands of diverse Indigenous cultures and nations, including 46 Indigenous treaty agreements in Ontario alone. So we're thankful to be able to work, live, and play on the lands and waters of the Dish with One Spoon treaty territory, which consists of much of Southern Ontario, including Toronto. eQuo recognizes and acknowledges the incredible historic and contemporary contributions made by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to Canada and the world. Lastly, finding meaningful ways to work together and to contribute to the strength of Ontario and to rural and urban Indigenous communities is one of our primary goals at eQuo. So we're excited about the future prospects of collaborating with Indigenous peoples, organizations, businesses, and communities, not only in Ontario, but across Canada. So Niawa and Miigwech, and thank you for listening and being part of this webinar. Dan Turcott is our producer today, and we will be taking questions throughout. So please in the chat, add any questions that you might have. Our topic today is law. So legal matters are often the things that founders view as being negative. They're a reaction to a problem. But great founders really do need great lawyers and accountants. And the reason that they need that is this should be part of the planning for the team and for the company in a proactive way. Unfortunately, too many people wait until it's too late to put proper planning in place. So what we're going to be discussing in the next hour are the legal matters that every entrepreneur should understand and implement so that they move away from being in a reactive situation, but proactively working towards the growth of their business and stop fires from happening in the first place. So why? Proper legal planning prepares your company for success and growth. Having the right shareholders agreements in place, ensuring that you have proper employee and customer contracts, understanding your financing options and their implications, as well as understanding and creating the right tax and exit strategies. So proper planning can have a material impact on your entire company. So joining us today is Jesslyn, Maurier, and Jonathan Ip. Jesslyn is a member of the Bennett Jones Technology, Media, and Entertainment Group. And her practice includes representation of startup, growth, and mature businesses, as well as venture capital and private equity sources on all aspects of the law relevant to the life cycle of technology or media businesses, but they're applicable pretty much across the board. Jesslyn advises her clients on a wide range of corporate and commercial matters, including shareholders arrangements, corporate reorganizations, protection of intellectual property rights, something that's very critical for Canadians especially, employment and human resource issues, domestic and international distribution arrangements, strategic alliances, partnerships, joint ventures, licensing, private financing, as well as mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of experience that we can tap into. Jonathan Ip is the founder of Iterative Law, a business law firm focused on delivering practical, business-first legal services for entrepreneurs. That includes startups and growth-oriented companies. He has over 15 years of experience in securities, mergers and acquisitions, corporate finance, as well as corporate and commercial matters for both private practice as well as company in-house counsel. He's worked with entrepreneurs, startups, blue chip companies in a variety of industries, and that includes the emerging blockchain and crypto. He's very, very forward when it comes down to technology. and he also happens to be eQuo's legal counsel. So really excited to have both of you. I'd like to welcome our audience today, and we are welcoming questions. So please in the chat as we go through. Dan Turcotte is going to help work through your questions. That way we can have a really productive session. So Jesslyn, I'm going to start with you. You work with founders at all stages. So what legal matters do you feel most affect founders in your experience? And what should they be implementing when it comes down to their business?
Thanks for the question, Barry. So I'm going to start with the assumption that there's more than one founder involved in a business. And it's very important for founders to think about their legal infrastructure, the legal foundation for their business. So as you mentioned in the introduction, to be proactive rather than reactive. And so one of the elements of a business's or a company's legal infrastructure may be a shareholders agreement or a partnership agreement. And that's the agreement between the founders. Let's assume that we're talking about a shareholders agreement. So a shareholders agreement will supplement the parties' rights under the applicable statutes. It will describe the rights and the obligations of the shareholders. There may be, restrictions on the transfer of shares. A shareholders agreement will set out the parties' expectations about how the business will operate, how it will conduct its affairs, what approvals are required, how will the company be financed, what decisions are to be made along the road. And so, think about founders are at the beginning of their business. They're excited. They're about to, embark on a project to, build something or produce something, whatever it is. But it's important for them to think about how things may develop along the way. And so the process of drafting a shareholders agreement forces them to kind of talk to each other about how this is going to go and what are their expectations. It's like a prenup for the business. And once you've had that conversation, once things kind of happen down the road, what if, someone wants to leave? What if somebody, what's the process for making decisions? Can they pledge the assets of the business? Can they, pledge their shares? What if somebody wants to become less active? What if somebody, is not pulling their weight? And so what if somebody starts to compete? And so having a shareholders agreement kind of sets out, okay, what are the rules? How do we address this situation? And in an ideal situation, you've had that kind of fulsome discussion so that you don't have to, you almost don't have to refer to the agreement because you sort of have talked it all out and you know what the plan is and you know what the rules are. Sometimes you have to look at the agreement, of course. But and furthermore, on the far end of things, when you're trying to sell the business, if you have, many shareholders, you've financed the business, you've got a whole bunch of shareholders, what are the rules for making them sell their shares in an exit scenario? And, I've seen situations where there isn't a shareholders agreement in place and the company finds itself having to chase all these shareholders to make them sign on to a purchase agreement. And some of them may be grumpy and some of them may not want to, cooperate. And so it can make for challenging situations if you don't have that kind of foundational constitutional document in place.
I think that's completely true. And in fact, I'm often surprised at how often shareholders take, in some cases, years before they start to formulate it. And too often, the impetus for them to then reevaluate it is something that tends to be negative. And so I think the advantage, at the ability to have founders come together and understand the terms, it greatly increases their success down the road. We're going to dive a lot deeper into shareholders agreements as well as other implications. Before we do that, I want to give Jonathan a chance. Your eQuo's lawyer. We've been really lucky to be able to work with you, Jonathan. We thank you for everything that you've done so far for us. What are the legal matters that you find in your experience that tend to not necessarily be thought of at the beginning, but end up having a profound effect on them and their ability to scale and grow and just be able to conduct their business every day?
Thanks, Barry. It's been really great working with you as well. And I'm really excited about where you've been taking the business, and definitely looking forward to continuing working with you. Your question, I think, in this day and age, a lot of businesses are technology oriented, or at least have some part of it technology oriented. And so I think intellectual property is probably one of the bigger things that people don't necessarily think about up front, or how to protect it. And so that becomes a bit of a problem when down the road, let's say you're trying to actually monetize your MVP, or you're thinking about selling your business at some point, and trying to scale, or just really kind of scaling the business, and you realize that, well, hold on a second, did I actually keep my secret sauce secret? Did those people that helped me build this, the consultants and developers I hire, did they actually transfer and give me ownership of what I think I own? And how do I know that I'm sort of, I'm actually able to use my intellectual property the way I want to? And so I think some of those questions need to be thought of very, very early on. So as for example, as a default position, if you're hiring someone not as an employee but as a contractor or a service provider, by default, whatever they create is actually theirs. It's not yours, unless the agreement says you get to keep it. And so that's really important. Thinking about, taking a step further, when you start talking to potential customers, strategic partners, are you signing confidentiality agreements? Are you making sure that you're not, accidentally telling someone, giving away your secrets and not trying to protect from them turning around competing against you? So I think those are kind of important questions to have. And then sort of just beyond that would be, to what extent are things so novel and so exciting that maybe you want to get patent protection? Do you want to protect your brands? Or we were talking about trademarks. Are we, looking at registering and enforcing those kinds of rights down the road? And just, again, it's about being thoughtful about it. It's always exciting to build products, but if you build something and you can't actually get value out of it because you didn't think about how to protect it to begin with, that's an unfortunate situation to be in.
Absolutely, and the interesting thing is, especially in Canada, there's been so much discussion of IP, and the reality is a lot of IP seems to be getting transferred, usually to foreign places, largely the U.S. And I don't think we spend enough time really understanding IP and the impact of the long-term value, because you might be getting all of this revenue, but the real value is actually that ownership of the IP rights. It's like in music. If you own the publishing, that's really where so much of the revenue is going to come through. So there are a few things that I want to start to maybe dive into. One is when you also think about value. And I'm going to jump back. Mike Sandalis just asked a really interesting question when it comes down to the shareholders agreement. And I think a lot of these things connect, because the value of the company is going to increase or decrease based on how well you've really understood people's roles, what the ownership of property is, what is the transfer, and where does that transfer extend itself when you start thinking about exits in particular. So at the end of the day, every entrepreneur is really looking at that exit. So Mike's asking, if you're drawing up a shareholders agreement and one of the shareholders just decides to become less active, how do you protect yourself at the beginning when everybody is, you talk about this being a prenup. Well, you're in the early dating stages. Everybody loves one another. As soon as you start to have cracks and you're not quite as keen on the individual, they stop working. How do you protect yourself?
If that's a question for me, I'm happy to answer. So I would start by saying that no shareholders agreement is, there are precedent shareholders agreements around, but what they really are a kind of menu of choices and different ways that things can be structured. And so no shareholders agreement is going to be alike. And so it's sort of like to take a whole picture look at this. How does the shareholders agreement interact with the employment agreements that might be in place with the shareholders? And how is the company being financed? Sometimes you have the kind of brains of the operation, and then you've got the money, and founders can play different roles. And so, one way of protecting the business might be to have an ability to buy a shareholder's shares back, to transfer them to the more active shareholder, and then you can set out formulas in the shareholders agreement about how the value of those shares will be calculated, and would those be paid for over time, how those would be financed. And so, there's different ways of doing it, but that is one example. I can't sort of provide a universal answer because it's going to be dependent on the situation, but that's one example of how that could be taken care of. And sometimes shareholders agreements have different provisions for sort of neutral exits. So somebody could be sick, or maybe they've passed away, versus they've done something bad. So they have competed, they have, or some other, they have, just decided kind of capriciously to sit on their hands and not participate in the business anymore. So there's different remedies for those situations, but that's all part of the kind of going in discussion about what are we trying to do here, and what is the 5-year plan, what is the 10-year plan for this business.
Okay. And
I think, Jesslyn, to your point as well, there's shareholders precedents and forms and things out there. I don't really recommend anyone just pull a form off and sign it and say this is good enough, because the reality is, like you were saying, these do need to be customized, because it's going to be based on what the founders want and what the founders' sort of interests are, and what they think. Each person's perspective and situation is different, and so I think it's definitely worth the conversation to explore and understand what the potential concerns are. And I think the other sort of point to this too is that the shareholders agreement is a living document. It's not as though you sign it and you never have to look at it again. I tend to tell people that you can treat it like an insurance policy as well. It's really annoying to talk about and think about, because people don't want to think about bad things. But once it's done, you throw it in the drawer, and if things are going well, you don't really look at it. But if something comes up, then you've at least planned for it. And on top of that, as the stages of the company changes, just like how as our life stages change, we may have to revisit that agreement and say, okay, does this still work for us? Do we need to make some changes to this in order to move forward and to kind of better reflect the reality of the business that we've now built?
I think that's a really good point, because things change at each stage, and likely a lot of people are going to get added into that shareholders agreement over time, and they may bring their own unique perspectives. So along with that, at the beginning, there's a lot that you're figuring out with the shareholders agreement. One of the things is going to be ownership allocations. How do you recommend that conversation and figuring out how the ownership application should actually work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think a lot of founders kind of default to, well, okay, there's 3 of us, so we just split the company, 3 ways. And that might be the simple answer. But this, again, becomes that larger conversation of, okay, there's 3 of us, but I'm doing it full time. You still have your job, so you're going to moonlight and do this off hours on weekends only, outside of using your own equipment and so on. So you're not getting in trouble with your employer. So you're not full time. Why should you get a third of the business up front if you're not putting the same amount of work as I am or the other founder? Or maybe the third founder is, hey, I'm willing to kind of pitch in for on a few things first and just kind of help you out, but but I don't think I'm actually quote unquote a founder in the sense of even part-time doing this on a regular basis. And so the dynamics are all going to be different there. And I think that's the first conversation, which is who's actually, like, how do you actually want to allocate the ownership? Does it make sense? I think some of the, Jesslyn can kind of speak to this as well, some of the toughest situations that I've had to help deal with would be two founders decide to split the business 50-50, didn't put a shareholders agreement in place at all. And then 6 months in, they hate each other, right? And under sort of default corporate law, if you don't have a majority of the shares, you can't do anything. 50% is not majority, right? So you can't actually do anything unless you talk to the other person and figure it out. And if you're not talking, you're kind of hoot. And so that's the same kind of conversation, whether it's two founders, three founders, because I think it's about being thoughtful about where people are today. And there are ways for us for you to kind of reward people if the founder decides to come on board full time, right? We can issue more shares, we can do options, we can do, provide an opportunity to earn more ownership in the company over time. So it doesn't have to be all negative in the sense of, if you leave, this is this is what happens to your ownership. It's, if you come in, if you do more work, we should reward you. Similar to how we think about options for for employees, right? It's an upside, it's a long-term incentive for you to do good work, because we want to allow you to participate in the growth of the business along with us founders.
So I like that, and Jesslyn, I'd like to see what your added thoughts are. I mean, one of the things that Jonathan pointed out that I know I've started to use in later businesses was you allocate a certain amount, and then the rest you agree on the principles or the milestones of how you can earn the rest. So you're allocating it, but now it's based on you got to deliver on the work. What other thoughts do you have in terms of how you create not just the ownership application, but think about the overall cap table? Because at the end of the day, the money conversations are usually where things start to get more difficult.
Yeah. There's some thinking as well to do around, there's founder shares that are probably issued at a nominal value. There may be, especially in the beginning stages of the business, there may be friends and family who are, financing your business, who are 10,000 here or 50,000 there, or they're able to help you kind of get off the ground. And you may, offer them equity as well. And so added shareholders can complicate things. And so one thing to think about is how to, whether some of the shares that you issue should be non-voting shares, for example, so that your friends and family, who you very much appreciate financing, your business in the initial stages, ultimately don't get in the way and have an outsized voice when you sort of have more institutional investors who, and so whether they should have non-voting shares, whether there should be a voting trust in place, they're giving you trust me money, and what you really want them to do is to kind of, you very much appreciate their money, but you want them to kind of be quiet and not get in the way when it comes time to get real financing. And that may be true as well for employees. You want to incentivize your employees. You want to give them some options. Think about what percentage of the cap table they should have. It should be appropriately small. And then also, should they have non-voting shares, or should they, give a voting trust? You want them to also participate in the shareholders agreement so that you're able to exit and have them not get in the way. And so it's all kind of a holistic picture of thinking carefully about your cap table and what kinds of shares you're issuing.
I think that's a really, really good point because especially when you're in tech, but I think increasingly you're seeing more companies open up the cap table, open up the ownership to employees. So I'd like to ask both of you, maybe we'll start with Jonathan and then come back to you, Jesslyn. What percentages, because I think sometimes people are trying to figure out what percentage should I open up as an employee pool? Because all of these things are interrelated, as you're saying. Everything is going to now reconnect back to the shareholders agreement. Everything's going to affect the cap table, which will have implications on future financing rounds. So want to try and maybe weave some of these together. Jonathan, how should we think about what level of percentage, and realizing it may differ based on industries?
Yeah, I mean the sort of I think guiding range is 10 to 20% of your cap table should be allocated for basically long-term incentives for employees, consultants, and so on through your option table. Now that being said, it does effectively get renewed every time you do a round of financing. So when say venture capital, your Series A or your seed financing, they tend, part of that process is, okay, you may have allocated X number of options to a bunch of employees. You're now starting to run low. We want to make sure you're actually able to continue to incentivize, new employees, existing employees, so you can give more. So as part of that whole, sort of round of financing, you're also going to reallocate or reconfigure your pool to, again, provide that once everything's settled, you still have that 10 to 20%. Now, this is for private companies, there are some restrictions if you ever become a public company. But as I tell my clients, like, that's a tomorrow problem, and that's a problem you can deal with if you're fortunate enough to be in this position where you can become public. But that's generally the guideline. And then it becomes a discussion of, how much do you think you need? The way I kind of like to plan with founders when they first start is, and because I like using even numbers, is what's the end number you want to end up with, assuming that your option pool is fully diluted and everyone's actually issued their shares. And so, is it 1 million altogether? Is it 10 million for that initial kind of piece? Because then I can backtrack and say, okay, that means if you want to own 20% of the company, I give you 2 million shares, and so on. And that's just so that, from a numbers perspective, it's a little bit easier to figure out. That all gets kind of skewed after you get, you do your additional rounds of financing, but it's nice to start with sort of simple numbers to think through and to have in your cap table to begin with.
That's great. So I'm going to throw it back over to you, Jesslyn, and I'm going to add to the conversation. So we've got 10 to 20% that's allocated. Within that, I'm going to have certain employees that I'm going to want to give more to versus other with less. How should I now think about issuing those, having them set apart, and now trying to figure out in a fair manner how to distribute them? How should one go about that?
Again, I think it's really dependent on the business, but you might think about bigger percentages, maybe 1%, 3%, somewhere in that range for more VP level, C-suite level, some kind of big title kind of person, and other the receptionist may not get options. I mean, they're important, but they're not contributing value in the same way. And the other thing to think about as well is how those options will vest. So a typical scenario is that a quarter of the options, so the options will generally vest over 4 years. A quarter of them will typically vest after the first year of employment, and then perhaps in equal monthly installments after that, so that at the end of the 4 years, they'll be fully vested. There may be time-based options, so they might be, some proportion of them might be purely time-based. If you're still an employee, you get them. Others may be performance-based, so that if you hit the following metrics, or the metrics get renewed every year, and the business does, X% growth, or whatever the relevant metrics might be, this other percentage, or this other portion of your options vest. In addition to that, what I've seen lately is that some businesses don't want any options to vest basically until a liquidation event. So until there's some exit, a go public situation, or some scenario where the employee can realize on their options, realize on their shares, and get some money right then. And so that really drives people towards that event. And if that event doesn't happen, I'm sorry, you got paid, but you don't get your options. That's another thing that I've seen as well. That is happening more frequently. But there's lots of different ways to structure the options. And the other thing I would caution people to do is to get tax advice when it comes to issuing options, because in particular, if options are issued below fair market value, that can lead to a negative tax result for both the company and the employee. And if you're issuing options to U.S. employees as well, that is also another piece where you should get tax advice and perhaps even a formal valuation to make sure that you're not issuing them below fair market value. So that can result in some challenges as well.
I think that's great. And that's actually a very nice segue into tax implications. There's a lot of considerations in terms of how you set up the organizational structure of the company, whether you incorporate, you don't incorporate, whether you incorporate and have a holding company. There are all these different variations. What are your thoughts, Jesslyn? You pick this up, then we'll move to Jonathan. From a tax standpoint, what are some key considerations that entrepreneurs should be thinking about?
Well, I'm not a tax lawyer, but I do hang out with tax lawyers all the time. And there's lots of different things, ways to get in trouble from a tax perspective. So some things that leap to mind are that, people should consider. There's the personal tax planning for shareholders. So significant shareholders in particular, do they want to hold their shares through a holding company, personally, et cetera? So there's that. There's, careful how you manage the company's money. So from an accounting perspective, are you properly accounting for your revenues and your losses? And another thing that sometimes at the early stage people can get into trouble is with shareholder loans. And so are you being paid as an employee or a contractor, or are you recording that as a loan from the company to the shareholder? Because shareholder loans can go both ways. The shareholder may loan money to the company, but sometimes the shareholder may treat the company like a piggy bank and, borrow money from the company. And that can lead to trouble. You can get dinged by the CRA because that is that's a taxable benefit. And so they kind of ding you if you don't pay it back in time or pay interest and all of that. So that's another thing to be cautious about. As I mentioned, there's the tax implications of options. There may be tax implications of if you're issuing preferred shares. What the terms of those preferred shares are may also lead to different tax results. And so I would just generally say it's important to have good accounting advice and good tax advice, both from the company's perspective and from the significant shareholders' perspective.
That's great, and I do agree. And as I mentioned at the start, I think a great lawyer and a great accountant are going to be your two biggest allies. So, Jonathan, I'd like you to build on that and kind of looping back to some considerations from a shareholders agreement. One of the things that I know I've had conversations about was you may have say, an older partner and a younger partner. You're going to have very different stages of life. And tax implications, and whether you take dividends, you decide not to take dividends, lower salary, higher dividends. The shareholders may be at odds, and the tax implications and how you can, to your point, Jesslyn, talking about using the company as a piggy bank, how the revenues, the profits end up getting split and utilized is going to have a big impact, not just on the tax implications, but it should probably circle back to some considerations and discussions in the shareholders agreement. Do you want to expand on what Jesslyn said and maybe go into a little bit of my question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that part of that depends on also what kind of business you're setting up, right? And what your sort of long-term goals for that business are. So, I think we've been sort of thinking, or at least talking about businesses set up in the sense of, a couple of founders looking to build a product or a service, and look for external financing, build that out, grow the business to a certain point where it gets acquired or goes public at some point. I mean, there's plenty of businesses that are more service oriented, professional services like lawyers and accountants and so on. Like those are businesses that also have the same considerations, and it might be a family run type of business where the family owns the various classes of shares in the company, and to your point, there are considerations around how you want to move the money out and how you pay people as a result. That's going to be quite different in those scenarios, because then you can have the flexibility of, say, for example, setting up different classes of shares so that one person owns one class versus another. And that allows you to then kind of decide, maybe this person gets more dividends and the other person takes more as employment income. It's a little bit harder when you're building that other sort of growth type business where you wouldn't be able to get external financing from investors if they saw you had multiple classes and you were able to kind of sprinkle dividends and return capital to people, to certain founders and not others, right? They sort of expect you to say, okay, you've got one class or two classes of shares, and so everyone, all the founders are one class, employees might be another, but that's about it. But that being said, yeah, there's that's definitely a discussion, and part of maybe for those types of businesses where it's I hate the term lifestyle businthis or lifestyle kind of company, but those are the businesses that I think are kind of the backbones of society, right? They're the ones that do not blow up 100 times in value, year over year, but they create jobs and they create stable income, they create stable revenues. And those are the kinds of businesses that are kind of small to medium size, and the ones that, sort of eQuo focuses on, where these kinds of considerations are probably more important than, hey, do I have the right, classes of shares and the types of shares, and in order to attract external financing, right? For those kinds of businesses, for the smaller businesses, your external financing is probably friends and family who aren't going to care too much about that, or maybe loans from BDC or the bank, and so they are more focused on what kind of business are you running? Are you generating revenue? Do we have confidence that you'll be able to repay your loan over time? And is this just going to help your cash flow and help you build your business and get you to that next level?
That's great. I want to kind of jump, Jesslyn, over to you from the standpoint of employees. I think, building on what Jonathan was saying, 90% of our businesses in Canada, for sure, are small businesses, but they occupy 70% of our employment. So when it comes down to thinking about employee options and employee pool, that's one thing that probably the majority aren't going to be implementing. But employee contracts, that's a whole other matter. What considerations should companies have in terms of drawing up employee contracts?
I would definitely recommend getting legal advice for employee contracts, especially, and contractor agreements, especially as the business matures and has deeper pockets. So Ontario is an extremely employee-friendly jurisdiction, and particularly of late, where the government has just outlawed non-competition agreements. So it is important to have good legal advice on your employment agreements, because otherwise, if you need to terminate an employee, they may be entitled to more than you are expecting. And so it's important really to not pull off some random precedent from Google, but to get good legal advice and to make sure that you're protecting the business, that if you intend to exclude common law entitlements on termination, that those are, properly set out. There's no guarantee that those will be enforceable, but at least you've tried, versus versus just, a piece of paper, one pager, or sometimes nothing, right? Sometimes people just, people show up and they start working and you start paying them, but you haven't set out your respective rights and obligations. That can be a dangerous situation. And so I just would recommend
don't take any random employment agreement. I've
Yes.
seen Canadian companies use US style ones that say that you are an employee, at hire, at will employee. No such concept here. Like that does not work. You cannot do that. And that will just get into a lot of trouble. So please don't do that.
Yes.
Well, and you mentioned, it's always great when you make that offer. I always love hiring new staff. Everybody's excited. You're bringing them on board. The whole staff seeing that the company's hopefully growing. They feel great that they have this opportunity. You feel great that now you can stop worrying about whatever that gap was that you couldn't fill. But at some point, termination comes up with some of the employees. And this starts to have some pretty big impact, potentially financially and otherwise, on obligations to the company. Jonathan, can you maybe start and just talk about some of the considerations when it comes down to how do you handle termination?
Yeah, termination is always sort of a tough situation, right? And it can be, be based on performance or lack thereof, but it could also be because of, external factors like COVID, for example, right, where your business suddenly is no longer able to operate. And those are all kind of tough situations to be in. And the way I kind of look at it is, it's you try to understand the perspective of both the employee and the employer as well. And so for an employer, there's some kind of, no longer a fit for whatever that reason might be. It could be, because the work isn't sort of up to what they're looking for, or it could be because they can't afford that person, that individual anymore because of their business situation. And so the considerations around that is, by default, the first thing you have to worry about is, well, what does the Employment Standards Act or the equivalent in the province or jurisdiction you're in, how does that, what does that say? What kind of entitlements does that person have at a minimum? What did you give in the employment agreement? Because at a very minimum, we have to give what's required by statute, but you might have offered more, right? Or you might have decided that this person, in order to entice them to come over, you're going to give them a better exit package if you needed to let them go down the road. I think it's very common for when an employer makes the decision to let someone go, to want to get some kind of release from them, right? So the employee is going to walk away, but you don't want the employee to turn around and then make some kind of claim that you didn't give them their entitlements under the Employment Standards Act, that there was a human rights issue, that there was a toxic environment, all those sorts of things, right? This kind of uncertainty around what happens after someone leaves, and there's always a concern that there may be some bad blood as a result of this, right? And because you just don't know what this particular situation is that's resulting in this termination. And so typically when you're looking for a release like that, you need to offer something in addition to what you've already given in an employment agreement. So you can't just say, hey, I promised you your entitlements under law, and I promised you an extra week of pay under the employment agreement. By the way, sign this release on top of it. Like that's not enforceable. So usually I think a lot of employers will say, look, I'm willing to pay you for an extra month if you agree that that's it. We walk away, where you promise not to turn around and make a complaint against me or some kind of claim against the company afterwards. You promise not to say bad things about us, and you continue to maintain your confidential obligations, and that's a typical offer. So it's almost by default you do offer a little bit more than what you already put in the employment agreement, because it gives you that the ability to kind of sleep at night knowing that there isn't a potential outstanding claim that may come down the road because the employee or former employee suddenly decides that they're very angry at you and wants to sort of make a point.
I think that's great. Thank you, Jonathan. I want to switch a bit now into just keeping track of time here, into some of the things that involve IP ownership. I think that the value is there. I know you have incredible people like John Ruffalo. You've got the Council for Canadian Innovators. This is a big conversational topic in terms of the importance of retaining IP. Jesslyn, what are considerations for companies to make sure that they know that they can control and own the IP that they're developing?
So this is one of the reasons for getting good employment advice. If your company is involved in IP and has IP worth protecting, it's important to have, clear employment. So by default, the employer of an employee should own all of their IP, but it's always helpful to have additional language around that to make sure that they also waive their moral rights if they are, developing IP, and to put on them an obligation to, perhaps sign additional agreements, confirming the ownership of the IP. So if somebody, leaves the company, you have the ability, you wanted to lock it down before they leave, but if they leave and something happens, you're trying to sell the company and counsel on the other side has a problem with the agreements, you'd want the ability to go back and find that employee and make them sign an additional confirmatory assignment. So there's that, but there's also contractors. It's especially important that the agreements be very clear as to who owns the IP, and that the IP belongs to the company and that it's assigned to the company. So it's very helpful to invest in good precedent agreements and to have somebody advising, if the law changes. A few years ago, they changed trademark laws. And so, keeping track of those changes so that you can put different magic words in the agreements if necessary. And I would also say on the, something that was mentioned earlier, just to pick up on it again, when we talk about branding, and, sometimes companies will, pick a fun name and, basically, you start to use it. And it kind of doesn't matter when they're small and just on the corner, but if they are, as they grow and they become, have more revenue, become a bigger name, it would be really tragic if they've invested all this time and resources into this brand name that suddenly gets on somebody's radar and, they then go after you because you've actually, violated their intellectual property. You've used their name, or there's some confusion around the name. So it's helpful to, at the start, invest in good IP searches to make sure that the name that you're using, the brand that you're investing in, and that hopefully will grow, is, and again, there's no guarantees, but at least you've done some basic research so that you haven't invested, time and money into something that is going to be problematic later and have claims brought against you.
I think that's really important. Jonathan, I'd like to ask for you to expand on that. And also, can you maybe clarify from an IP standpoint, you've got trademarks, you've got copyrights, you've got patents. There are a lot of words that a lot of people hear. They don't fully understand what they are, but it all reverts back to that notion of IP. Can you maybe expand?
Yeah, I'd love to. And this is sort of very, very high level, because if you want to get the proper expertise, there are very sophisticated, intellectual property lawyers that can help you with not only the registrations and all that, but actually kind of understand the limitations and what sort of, works and what doesn't. But very, very broadly, patents relate to protection of ideas, actual sort of novel ideas or combinations of existing products that no one has thought of before. So the actual concept itself, right? And so that typically gives you, call it 20 years of exclusivity. So a patent involves actually registering and providing to the public in a registry sort of what your new novel idea or product or whatever it is. In exchange for that, you get exclusive rights to it, to use that and to produce it for typically a 20-year term. Trademarks refers to the sort of the logo, the branding, the identity of often it's the business or the product, and it's the association you have with that particular logo, the name, and all the kind of goodwill that goes with it. So, for example, when you mention Coca-Cola, you know what that is. When you mention Apple, you know what that is, and everything associated with it. And so it's the ability to protect if someone uses Apple on not their computers, but on, say, coffee. Is that their product or not? And is there a potential confusion that Apple created that coffee, therefore it should have the same level of and quality and standard? And so that's that kind of protection around there. Copyright is sort of bridges, it's not the protection of ideas, it's the expression of a particular idea. So that covers things like the traditional concept of copyright would be, your novels, your screenplays, that sort of thing. It covers code because that is a way of expressing a particular idea. So I think a good way of thinking about it is a lot of novels out there kind of generally kind of follow that kind of hero narrative, right? Where somebody unassuming learns that they have a special gift. They go through a lot of challenges, slay the evil dragon, find the treasure, bring it back to their family or society, and they're better for it. That's a general idea, but the copyright would be on the Harry Potter series, the Lord of the Rings. The concepts are all very similar. It's the way you express it that's different. And then the last one would probably be trade secrets, which is basically a way of, there's something so unique that you don't want to tell anybody. You want to protect that in such a way that it's completely secret. No one knows how to use it except for a select few. So a great example is the magical formula to Coke. So Coca-Cola famously has a secret formula that no one knows about. And I think, the rumors are that there's two people in the company that owns it, and they split the actual recipe, so neither of them actually ever have it at any particular point in time. So that's a trade secret protection.
That's fantastic. So I want to merge from the notion of IP and start to get into one of the things that we had talked about extensively prior to this webinar, which was when you're taking a look at either funding or acquiring capital. There's a lot that needs to happen, and when we're looking at, for instance, trying to figure out going in for a line of credit with your bank or finding funding with investors, that what we're really looking at being able to do is to present ourselves in a manner that they're going to likely say yes. And oftentimes that has to do with how well your paperwork, your accounting, all these things are in order. But maybe you discuss, and then Jesslyn will throw this over to you. What is the importance of minute books, data rooms, vaults, all of these notions that actually get into due diligence issues that are really going to impact a banking or an investor and the likelihood of them actually giving you the capital that you need?
Yeah, I think there's the legal requirement. So, by law, you have to maintain a minute book with certain registers and certain information that has to be available to the shareholders, as well as, sort of the corporate director in the province and that sort of thing. You have to produce it, right? But beyond that, to your point about financing, it's about, the way I think of it is it's about providing comfort that when someone's thinking about giving you money, that you actually know what you're doing and that you're organized and that you can execute on that business plan you showed them, right? Because a bank, when they're looking to give you a business loan, they will ask you for your financials. They'll ask you for, your projections, your business plan, and then they're going to do a bit of additional digging. And actually, external investors will do this too, right? They'll want to know, to see all your corporate records, and if they go even deeper, they want to know that all your, you've signed agreements with your employees, your consultants. They want to know that you have agreements with your suppliers and actually your clients, right? And they want to know how long those terms are and that you do have them maybe locked down for 5 years and that you're guaranteed, this kind of recurring revenue and so on. Broadly speaking, it's about giving them that comfort that that you actually can execute, and that that the money that they're giving to you will actually be used properly. And it's a very easy metric for them to, and I think it's helpful when they say, hey, we want to see your data room, we want to see, you know, this information, where is it? For you to say, oh, no problem, here's the link to it, right? It could be a Google Drive, it could be a Dropbox, it could be you know, something else, but it gives them that initial impression of, oh, these guys know what they're doing, as opposed to, you know, A, I don't have it, or B, oh, it's in this folder and it's just a mishmash of documents and some of it's signed, some of it isn't. It's that first impression, right? And impressions, particularly because it's such a competitive space, right? When it comes to looking for money, lots of people are going to banks for money. Lots of people are going to investors for money, and so it's an easy metric for them to say, organized, I'm going to look deeper. Not organized, I'm a little worried. I'm going to pass and look at someone else.
That's great. So Jesslyn, what would you add to that? And what are your thoughts when it comes down to investor relations and any legal obligations once you've gotten that money?
So I completely agree with what Jonathan said. Having good records is a sign of maturity, a sign of organization, that, you know, you have a handle on your business and your documents. And it's also a helpful planning tool to kind of know what you have and be able to assess your situation. And so it is an investment. It does take time, but your future self will thank you if you've done it along the way, because it's much less painful than to try to fix things up, or to discover that your records are incomplete, or that this thing wasn't signed after all, and to have to go chase around to fix everything. It's much easier for a legal counsel as well to give you to give an investor or to give a bank a legal opinion if your kind of house is in order, because then they can, otherwise they have to go and fix things, and it's, can cause a lot of delay, can cause more expense. And so, doing things right sort of the first time as best as possible is always helpful, than try to fix things later. In terms of investor relations, once an investor has invested in your company, it's going to be driven somewhat by the shareholders agreement. And so there's sort of the baseline of what the shareholders agreement requires that you provide in terms of information and reporting to the shareholders. But it's also helpful, to let your investors know how the business is doing in general, to continue to tell a meaningful story, whether it's positive or maybe, it's a little bumpy, to tell a meaningful story to your investors, because hopefully, they're willing to finance you again on the next round of financing. Next time you need money, you want them to have that confidence in the business and the plan. And so it's useful to continue to provide meaningful updates, and to involve them in the business too. Like, they may be board members in your company, and that is also a very helpful resource, of advice for your company. So some people treat boards just as a kind of rubber stamp, as a kind of annoyance, a kind of formality that has to be gone through. But your board can actually be a very useful resource of advice, direction, risk mitigation, etc. So look at it that way.
Well, I want to thank everyone. So Jesslyn Maurier with Bennett Jones, Jonathan Ip, Iterative Law. Please reach out to them with any questions that you have with regards to any legal matters. Would also like to thank Dan Turcotte for helping on the produce today. There was a lot today, and there's a lot that we didn't even touch upon. So I'd like to end by saying any founder out there, find a good lawyer, talk with Jonathan, talk with Jesslyn, really understand all of the various implications that are on you personally as well as the company from a legal standpoint. And I guarantee you they're going to be intertwined with having a good accountant in that conversation. We are eQuo. You can visit us at eQuo Shift, EQUO shift.com. We are creating the first distributed marketplace to help founders connect with investors, with capital, with customers, and our goal is also to help make sure that we're educating people to understand what all these things actually mean in terms of the growth of their business. So I want to thank the audience for joining us today, and I'd really thank the panel. So thank you very much.